much. David Gura here in for Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons. Again, watching the action at the White House, waiting to hear from Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada, who's visiting Washington today, and President Donald Trump having a meeting in the Oval Office and a luncheon after that. I want to dig into sort of the import of that meeting, which comes just about a week after the latest federal election in Canada, and some heated words exchanged verbally and via social media posts between these two leaders, and President Trump setting the table today for this conversation, posting on Truth Social this morning. I look forward to meeting the new Prime Minister of Canada, he writes. I very much want to work with him. He then says, we don't need anything they have other than their friendship, which hopefully we will always maintain. They, on the other hand, need everything from us. So again, the president setting the table for this conversation. We'll see if the issues of sovereignty comes up in addition to talking about trade and tariffs policy. Nathan Dean joins me here in the studio in Washington, senior U.S. policy analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. Let me start with a broad question. What does each of these leaders want out of this meeting today? There was a lot of bombast from Mark Carney on the campaign trail. Sovereignty was not a negotiable thing, he said over and over again. He's promised to stand firm when it comes to issues of trade. Walk us through, for both him and for President Trump, what they hope to get out of this meeting in the White House today.
I think both leaders want incremental wins. I don't think you're going to expect much. Look, I don't think nobody's anticipating a trade deal is going to come out of this meeting, but I think you get incremental wins. When it comes to the Prime Minister Carney, I think it's just a signal that there's going to be additional negotiations. For President Trump, obviously he wants to see that something that Canada is giving, whether it's, a change of non-tariff related measures or price controls or something like that. And when President Trump says on Truth Social that, there's nothing that we don't need, well, our analysts think differently. I mean, when you talk about the energy sector, the agricultural sector, Steve Mann was just on talking about automobiles. Mm-hmm. For the investment point of view, I think the best thing that can come out of this meeting is that there is a decision to keep talking, a decision to keep negotiating, and that the rhetoric doesn't go much higher than it already has.
What is your assessment of the temperature when it comes to this bilateral relationship? So you bring up the auto sector. You and your colleagues have been tracking all of kind of the changes and walkbacks and postponements and pauses when it comes to these trade deals. When it comes to the U.S.-Canada negotiations, on that long list of bilateral negotiations the White House says it's having, how hot is it? Where do things stand in that conversation?
So I was in New York last week, and I think in talking with all the traders that I talked about going around Midtown, it was all the focus was on India, South Korea, and Japan. The idea in Asia, Canada is, I would call it, in that second tier. Now, look, Canada and Mexico, extremely important. I mean, obviously, they're our biggest trading partners, but I think from the market perspective, they really want to resolve what's going on with U.S. and China. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent sort of hinted today that there really isn't any pathway right now between the U.S. and China. So in this meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Trump, if there's any indication that this can move forward to a trade deal, and I'm going to use deal in air quotes, maybe call it a memorandum of understanding, just even a couple of pages with bullet points. That's something the market can actually start to say, look, now we can start negotiating. Now we can start moving towards that pathway where when Secretary Bessent says deals are coming, if there's any indication of this meeting that we're moving on that path, I think the market may actually look at that meeting and say, okay, let's take a breather here.
Let me, if I may, pull you away from policy for just a moment to the politics of this moment. And you've watched any number of these meetings unfold. What have we learned about how world leaders should comport themselves when they're in a venue like this, in the Oval Office with the president? Yes, so much attention is being paid to what deals may or may not come out of a meeting like this one. We've seen a variety of approaches from world leaders when it comes to being in the spotlight like this.
Well, you and I were just watching, the handshake before we went on the air.
And pumped his fist as well.
Prime Minister Carney pumped his fist. I mean, we didn't see the President Macron, 30-second handshake here. But, what I would say is that, President Trump always has his persona that he is online, but then he has a different persona when he's actually in the White House. And I would think that, the Prime Minister's perspective, look, he just won an election on the fact that he's going to be an anti-Trump candidate and that he is going to be very much Canada first, to use that term. So, it certainly will be interesting to see what a fly on the wall in that conversation looks like. But I think that if, they focus on actual specifics of the trade negotiations rather than things on like being the 51st state, then obviously, the markets can actually, say this is something that we can move forward and we can work with.
I want to ask you mentioned Scott Bessent just a moment ago in the comments that he made on Capitol Hill today. How would you characterize his message, what he's saying yes to markets and investors, as he said yesterday, his message to lawmakers as well, how he's kind of characterizing or driving home what the Trump administration's economic message is at this point in time?
So he's the calmer in chief. That's what I call him.
Calmer in chief. I love that.
It's one of those things where you look at the market participants and they really want Scott Bessent to be that individual that says, look, there is a lot of rhetoric coming out of the White House, but here's how that rhetoric actually gets implemented. And you hear Secretary Bessent usually use the terms of his three pillars: tariffs, taxes, and deregulation.
We'll leave it there. Nathan Dean, our analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. We go to the Oval Office.